Well, good morning, Heritage family. Isn't it good to be together for worship together this morning? I am so glad that we're getting to spend this time focusing our attention on the Lord. My name is Brock Polk. If you're one of our guests today, I want to let you know I'm part of the ministry staff here, and I look forward to the chance to get to meet you. And I'm thrilled that you've joined us today. In fact, it's our hope that you will give us a chance to connect with you, because we are a family of people who are on a spiritual journey, and we know that you are also on a spiritual journey, and we believe that the journey toward Christ-likeness is meant to be traveled together. And so we're better when we follow God in community. We believe that God is writing this big redemptive story in the world. In fact, we're convinced that God's story was not finished when the pages of the Bible were, done being written all those years ago. That the story of God is so much bigger than the parts that we can read about from ancient history here in the scriptures. We know that there were different authors who wrote parts of the Bible who told us that God's story was going on long before the events of the earliest pages of Scripture, and that God's story is going to continue for all of eternity, that God created the earth and everything in it and is overseeing the story of the world today, but that one day the next chapter of the story will begin when Jesus calls to live in His presence those who have trusted their lives to Him, which means that one of these days, this current chapter of the story of God is going to come to an end. I wonder if you've ever had one of those moments where you were at the movie theater and the movie ended and the credits started to play, but then before you got out of the room, you noticed that there was extra content after the credits. I remember this happening to me. It was 24 years ago, and I went to see Monsters, Inc. in the theater. Some of you weren't even born yet, I know. But this old Pixar animated movie, I went to see it in the theater with some friends, and the movie ended and the credits started to roll, and we got up from our seats and started walking out. But then a theater employee caught us at the door and said, if you'll stick it out just a few more minutes, said there's a surprise at the end. Okay, and it was great. We went back in and we waited, and there were outtakes, there were bloopers, which would be totally sensical, except it was an animated movie, which meant that they created the outtakes on purpose. They created the bloopers as a joke, and they were the best part of the entire show. It had us cracking up. But it may have been the first time that, because I was sitting there waiting to see what was next, I actually paid attention to the credits as they scrolled and watched all of the titles and the names of all of those. I mean, it must have been 1,000 people who got referenced, whose names were mentioned as contributing to this massive animated project. And it got me thinking about all of those individuals, about how each one of them played a role, some of them that seemed really big and some of them that seemed really small, but they all got to have a participatory role in creating this delightful story. There were voice actors and producers, and there were artists, and there were animators, but there were also accountants and software engineers and finance clerks, and everybody had an assistant, and the assistants had assistants, it kind of seemed like. But there were all of these people who had contributed to this project. And in my mind's eye, I imagined how proud those people must have been to buy tickets to the show on opening weekend and take their families with them and wait until the movie was over and watch those credits and say, everybody stay seated, and watch as the moment when their name came across the screen. And they got to be able to point and smile, and everybody in their family was excited to celebrate that with them. But they must have been so proud to have a part to play in telling this awesome story. But I've also seen situations where people are part of a story, but they don't seem very engaged in it. Situations where people are wrapped up in a narrative and they're supposed to be helping to share a narrative, but they aren't really, they don't have their heart in it. A few weeks ago, I noticed a headline in my news feed that said that there were some restaurants in Fort Worth that had been receiving terrible grades from the health inspector. And it was one of those things where just clickbait, my curiosity made me click the link, and I read it, and I was terrified. I was not terrified. I was so dismayed to find out that one of the restaurants that Sarah and I have enjoyed eating at the most got like terrible grades from the health inspector. I mean, it was bad, like it was the kind of thing where they were saying, this is urgent, we're going to have to shut you down if you don't get this stuff fixed, And every time we've been there to eat, the food has been awesome, the atmosphere has been great, the servers have been kind to us, but apparently back in the kitchen, it was a totally different deal. There was a whole different story that was going on the other side of those swinging double doors. And you know that if you eat at restaurants very often, you've probably had the experience of looking up reviews and trying to decide if you were going to try that new place in town. Some restaurants will even incentivize their clients, their customers, to leave a review online because they're depending on that good word of mouth to keep new customers coming, right? But it's common. When you're reading those reviews, it's common to find the stories of customers who will say, boy, the venue was nice and the food was great, but my experience with the servers made it so I don't want to go back, right? You've read those kinds of stories. And they were disappointed about the experience that they had with the people who were supposed to be creating the narrative, telling the story, building the environment and the atmosphere. It's interesting how first impressions can really spoil the experience and the opinion you have of a place, right? And then once you've formed a first impression, once your mind is made up about some place, it's hard to convince yourself of anything different. And I'm sure that one of the great challenges that restaurant owners and managers face is trying to convince their staff to think of themselves as ambassadors for the restaurant. They're trying to create this atmosphere. They're trying to create a vibe, right? But creating the vibe requires that the whole team be excited about living out the story. Well, following Jesus means living into the story that God is telling in the world. And we mention this frequently here at Heritage, but one of the most incredible truths that we've learned is that God's story is a story we've been invited to play a part in. Like God has saved a place for you. If this was a movie that was going to have credits rolling at the end of this chapter, there are spaces where your name and my name are intended to go because God is working through us to tell the redemptive story of creation. But the question that we constantly have to reflect on is, which story are we actually telling? Which story are people picking up on when they encounter us? And it's true for us as individuals. What's the story that people are reading? What's the story that people are learning or picking up on when they encounter you as an individual follower of Jesus? And we're each living out this narrative in our own context and our own little spheres of influence. But it's also true as an us thing, right? What's the story that we together, collectively, are living out? Are we living out a story that communicates a Jesus-centered message? Because everybody who encounters us, and when we encounter each other, we're sharing a story. We're living into a narrative. You can feel it when we're gathered together here on Sunday mornings. You can feel it as you walk in, next to some other folks as you come in from the parking lot. You can feel it as you come in the doors to the building. You can feel it when someone in our family goes through a crisis or has something big to celebrate. You can feel it in the way that we engage people who are new to our family. You can feel it when we connect with people from out the other parts of the community who connect with the Heritage Church family at times. Every interaction we have in the context of church makes an impression on somebody. We're telling a story by the way we interact. And this has always been true. Since the earliest days of the church, almost 2,000 years ago, Christians have been invited to live into a particular story, the Jesus story, for the sake of others. We're called to live into this story in the way that we interact with one another, in the way that we interact with the society around us. And so this morning, I want to call our attention to one short passage of Scripture that's found in the New Testament book of 1 Peter. If you've got a Bible with you, I would be thrilled for you to join me in 1 Peter chapter 4, because this is a message from one of the original teachers, one of the original messengers of Jesus, helping us understand what this can look like and the why behind our desire to live into this story. So you need to know Peter, who wrote 1 Peter, he was a follower of Jesus, but he wasn't just any follower of Jesus. He's probably the most familiar of all the followers of Jesus written about in the Bible. He's the disciple who first declared he believed Jesus was the Son of God. He is the follower who likely spent more time in person with Jesus than any other disciple ever did. Jesus gave Peter an important role in the beginnings of the church, and Peter lived out the rest of his days as a preacher and a missionary. He was telling other people about Jesus with his life. And he writes this letter that we call 1 Peter to a bunch of Christians. In fact, they called it a circular letter, which meant he wrote it down once and they were supposed to pass it around to a number of different churches and share it. You know, they didn't have photocopy machines or anything, so they were going to pass it around. And so he writes it to all of these churches in what's now modern day Turkey. But it's this small groups of Christians who are facing all sorts of challenges and persecution and threats to their life and their community, things like that, simply because of their faith. And Peter writes them this letter to encourage them. And we call it 1 Peter because there's another letter in the Bible written by Peter, a second letter. And you can probably guess what we call that one. I'll leave it up to you there. But in 1 Peter, he's giving these Christians instruction about how to live out their little portion of the Jesus story. And we're going to read just 5 short verses. 1 Peter chapter 4, 5 verses from this letter. But these 5 verses cast a big vision, instructing Christians on how to tell the story from where you are and from where we are. So here we are, 1 Peter chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. Here's what he says. He says, "The end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and be of sober mind so that you may pray." In other words, Peter says this chapter of God's story is going to wrap up before long. He says Jesus could come back any day now, and God has already accomplished what is necessary to save the world, and so we're getting close. And Peter's not trying to predict a particular date. He's not like being prophetic about, it's going to come on a certain day or anything like that. But what he's doing is what the other New Testament writers do when they discuss the end of all things. He's trying to say, it's time to get serious. Let's take this, let's treat this like it's real and like it's urgent and like it's a priority for us. He says, because the time is getting close, do not live your life out of control. Be alert and of sober mind, he says. Pay attention and stay focused. Pray for God to keep working in the world around you, to keep working through you until this time comes. And he implies that the fact that the end is near is supposed to stimulate action on our part. We should make decisions about who we're going to be and how we're going to behave and how we're going to live based on our conviction that there is a time when this chapter of God's story is going to end, and we're going to move on to the next one. But then in verse 8, Peter says, above all, okay, above all in response to the fact that Jesus is coming back, above all, in response to the fact that you're taking this seriously. Above all, he says, love each other deeply. All right, remember, he's talking to little groups of Christians. He's talking to churches. He's talking to a group like us. And he says, above everything else, I mean, he's already written 3.5 chapters, right? We're in chapter 4, but he says, out of everything I've already told you, above everything else, he says, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. And it's not surprising that Peter would instruct us to focus on love. I mean, Jesus said, loving God and loving your neighbors are the two most important things you can do to live your life His way. But Peter goes on and he goes a step further and he gives us a new reason for loving. He says love covers over a lot of sins. Apparently, when we're living in Christian community together, our love for one another can make it easier to forgive one another. Our love for one another can make it easier to look past one another's faults. And I know this isn't surprising to you because you've had a family before, right? And you know what it's like when you're in a relationship with someone and you're inclined to show them more grace than you would somebody that was outside the circle, right? You're inclined to show somebody more grace because they're part of you. They're connected to you. They're part of your family, part of your inner circle. And they can get away with stuff that would make you a lot more frustrated with a total stranger out there, right? Peter says, start loving each other now. Above everything else, prioritize this. Love each other now because it'll help you to tell God's story of forgiveness. Now, move on to the next verse, verse 9, and he says, offer hospitality to one another. Okay? Now, if we just stopped that verse right there, and if we just said, offer hospitality to one another, then we might be able to come up with some creative ways that we can do this, but I want you to notice that he adds a little caveat there at the end. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling, which is to say, offer hospitality to one another and mean it. You know, like do it because your heart is in it. Not because you have to, not because it's something that you're supposed to do. And I don't know what word comes to mind for you when you hear, or I don't know what comes to mind when you hear the word hospitality. Sometimes hospitality can conjure up images, you know, in your imagination of tea parties and bland conversation, you know, things like that. But in the Christian tradition, hospitality is about making room, you know. It's about when somebody walks in and they need a place to sit. It's about scooting over so that they have a spot. Hospitality in the Christian tradition is about welcoming the stranger and saying, I don't know you, and we're different, and we have very different backgrounds and convictions and beliefs and experiences and all of that, but you're someone made in the image of God and you're my neighbor, so come be with me. Come and be welcomed among me and my family. And Peter says, not only do we need to be people who welcome others into our community, but we need to do it gladly. We need to do it without grumbling. We need to do it because our heart is in it. And then he goes on, we're 2 verses away. Verse 10, he says, each one of you, everybody in the church, each one of you should use whatever gift you've received. And you've received some gifts, right? Like you can think about a few gifts that you've received. Of course, some of you, your imagination might immediately think, well, the preacher's going to talk about spiritual gifts. And that's true. But those aren't the only gifts you've received, are they? Peter says each of you in the church should use whatever gifts you've received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. You remember, you may not, but I grew up in church singing a song that the chorus said, count your blessings, name them one by one. And if I tried to count all of the different ways that God has shown grace to me, all of the ways that God's grace in its various forms has made itself evident in my life, I don't know, there's no way I'd ever be able to count it all. And this is what Peter's talking about. Peter says the things that God has done to show grace in your life, and maybe it's through spiritual gifts, and maybe it's through resources, and maybe it's through family, and maybe it's through creativity, and maybe it's through talents and connections that you have. But Peter says whatever you've received, all of the ways that God has shown grace to you, it's meant to be used to serve other people. All of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others. And so once we've been involved and welcomed into community, Peter says, use what you have for the sake of the people that are connected to you, that are on the journey with you. He even says this is how we deliver God's grace to other people. Like some of the things that God has done in my life, if I share them, then they're going to feel like things God's done in your life too, right? This is how this is supposed to work. We're conduits of God's grace, spiritual gifts and earthly resources given to us for the sake of ministry. It's not for just enhancing our self-esteem. It's not for drawing attention to ourselves. These gifts that God has given to us, all the different kinds of gifts, they're meant for the community. And so Peter elaborates on this in verse 11, the last verse we'll read together. He says, if anyone speaks, does anyone in here speak, by the way? If anyone speaks, which means he's talking to you, he's talking to me. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. It's interesting to think that of all of the ways that God has given His grace to you and to me, His grace has entered our lives in so many various forms, according to verse 10. One of those ways is that God gave you a voice, right? One of the ways that God's grace has entered your life is that you were given a voice. And in order, according to verse 10, we're supposed to be faithful stewards of all of the gifts God has given us. And so in order to use your voice as a steward, in order to use your God-given voice in the way that God intended for it to be used, Peter says, speak as if you're speaking on God's behalf. Speak as if you're going to say the things that God would have you say. If anyone speaks, speak as if they're speaking the very words of God. And if anyone serves, they should do so with the strength that God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To Him be the glory and the power forever and ever. And I love it because the letter's not even done, but he just bursts into prayer right there in the middle of it. In fact, there's even an amen in my translation at the end of that. And in this last verse, Peter's making it clear that there is one goal for all of this. There's one goal for all this instruction he's been giving us over these verses, and the goal is that God would be praised, that God would get the glory in this story. Our role is to do what we can to make sure that God gets glory through us and that God gets glory because of us, right? This is our assignment. And when you put together all the verses that we've read together this morning, all the 5 verses, you get a list that looks like this. Number 1, pay attention and pray for God to be at work. Number 2, love the people that are around you. Number 3, make room for strangers and do it eagerly. Number 4, serve other people in your own unique way. And number 5, speak and act in ways that bring God more honor. Y'all, if you wanted to boil down what it looks like to try to live the Jesus way, if you wanted to try to condense into a list what it's supposed to look like for us to be followers of Jesus, this is a pretty good list right here. This is a pretty succinct and helpful and understandable way to think about it. Peter is telling us, hey, listen, the credits on this part of the story are just about to roll. Jesus is coming back. He's defeated death, and He said that He's preparing a place for us to come and live with Him forever. And so if you want your name to be in your reserved spot in the credits, if you want to be part of the story that God is telling, the way you do it is by sharing and serving and speaking in ways that draw attention to God. To use your voice, to use your energy, to use your time, to use your possessions and belongings, to use your spiritual gifts and everything you've got to point toward God. And if Peter was with us today, if Peter was somehow able to speak directly to the Heritage Church in 2025, I'm convinced he'd say something very similar. I'm convinced he'd say to us, all of you have been drawn to God, and you've received talents and resources and an entire community of support and encouragement and backup. So use this opportunity to be a part of the big story. And this message applies to us on an individual level. It does. On an individual level, we've got opportunities all the time to live out the Jesus story in our cubicles and in our offices and at our lunch tables and in our classrooms and in our homes. We have daily opportunities to love and serve and speak the words of God and to make room for other people the same way that Jesus has made room for us. We have individual chances to do this all the time, and we should be on the lookout for these opportunities. But there's a community aspect to this as well. You may have noticed a theme this morning. Kevin and Mateo and I are all talking about what it means for the family of God, the people of God, to invest our energy serving one another. And Peter's not just talking to individuals when he wrote this letter. He wrote this letter for groups. He wrote this letter to be read out loud in churches among people who came from different socioeconomic backgrounds. There were people who were rich and people who were poor. There were people who were men and people who were women, and that was a huge dichotomy in their culture 2,000 years ago. There were people on every area of the social stratosphere, and Peter writes this letter to be read in community, this entire group of people, and saying, all of you extend grace to one another. All of you extend hospitality to each other and to your neighbors. This is the mission of every church in every era. I mean, most churches, we have our own mission statement, but it's just some version of this. Extend grace to each other and to your neighbors. We're a family, a spiritual community. We're on mission together. And since God has blessed this community with a particular, diverse set of spiritual gifts. I mean, look around the room. There's people in here that have a very different experience than you do. There's like 5 or 6 generations represented in here. There's people in here who have been through so much different stuff. And we have different gifts, different resources for ministry in our particular culture. And we, Heritage family, we are spiritually equipped and uniquely situated to live out the story in a way that no other church family can. Did you realize this? Like, there's a lot of churches in this community, and any church that honors the name of Jesus, I'm proud of them, and I'm wishing them the best, you know. But there's something unique about each one of them, and you are one of the things that's unique about this church family. There's a unique blend of experience and background and understanding and spiritual gifts that's inside of you and in each one of us that makes this church family unique. And there's a particular location and a particular origin story of how we got to be centered right here in the middle of the Heritage neighborhood. And there's a particular set of community members that we're connected to around here. And all of that means that we have a unique opportunity, a particular opportunity to live out the story right here. And with that in mind, we're extending an invitation today to all of us to reconsider how we're joining the mission that makes Heritage a community where we feel welcomed and where people coming to see us from outside feel welcomed and where the entire community points to Jesus. This is a question we've always got to be reconsidering and reevaluating. Because God has made sure that we have what we need. Peter says, His divine power, God's divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of Him who called us, which is Jesus Christ. Peter says we've got what we need to do what God expects of us or hopes for us today. In this family, we've got energy and creativity and passion and means to do important work to advance the kingdom of God right here, but we need to work together so that God can use us to become contagious with one another, right? So that God, I don't mean that in a COVID sense, I mean that in a spiritual sense, right? And so that we can become the kind of community that's constantly pointing each other towards spiritual maturing and growth. And the truth is, if we're going to show love and extend hospitality and serve meaningfully as a family here at Heritage, there are a lot of jobs that need to be filled. In fact, if there's anybody in the church who's not contributing their spiritual gifts toward the mission, then it means that we have an assignment problem. You know, it's kind of like being an unemployment problem. Some of the opportunities around here happen organically. Some of them happen informally. Some of the opportunities to serve happen and nobody else ever hears about them. But there's lots of opportunities where we need members of our family to step up and say, where can I help? I want to be a part of the story. I don't know if you've noticed, this morning when we had all of the praise team up here, you may have noticed that the two sopranos standing here looked a little bit similar to one another. It's because it's mother and daughter, Laura and Autumn. And then over here, you've got Mateo in the back and his daughter Liliana. And those two are teenagers. And then we've got a teenager who's running the camera. We got 3 teenagers who are volunteering in the AV booth right here. We've got teenagers who are manning the doors and helping as greeters. We've got teenagers who are helping, that are going to be down there next hour helping with children's ministry. And it's so incredibly beautiful to me that our teenagers, our middle school and high school students are leading the way for us as a church family in using their spiritual gifts for the sake of the community. There's a letter, you can clap for that. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome. And there's another letter in the New Testament where Paul, the Apostle Paul, writes to one of his proteges in ministry who's kind of a young minister, and he says to him, he says, don't let anyone look down on you because you're a young minister. He says, but instead set an example for the rest of the believers in faith, in life, in love, and in purity. He says, let your youth give you a platform to show the rest of the church what it's all about. And I am so proud, so grateful that many of our teenagers are doing just that. They are leading the way for us in service and utilizing their gifts for the sake of the community here. But I also want to tell you, that also means we have a lot of teenagers who could teach you how to do some of this stuff. Remember when we used to have teens teach us how to program the VCR, things like that, or use your mobile phone? We got some teens who can teach you how to do some of this stuff, who will help to show you the way. And there are all of these opportunities around here, and currently many of the opportunities for service around Heritage and in our family are being left undone, which means that there is still huge opportunity for hospitality. There's still incredible opportunity for more connection. There's opportunity for us as a family to give glory to God in greater and greater ways. But living out our part of God's story means that each one of us needs to wrestle, truly wrestle with the question, what is the role that I am called to fill in the family of God? And I want you to experience the inspiration that comes from being an active part of God's family. You need to be part of telling God's story, not for the sake of the organization. I'm talking about for your own soul, for your own heart, for your own spiritual growth. You need to experience what it's like to let the Lord work through you, to let the Lord pour grace through your life into somebody else's life. And we're not asking so that Heritage can succeed as an organization. We're not asking so that this particular little group of church, members in Tarrant County can rise in estimation or fame or anything like that. We want God to get the glory for every good thing that happens here at Heritage. But we believe more good things happen when all of God's people work together to be salt and light in our community, when we all team up. And so I'm asking you this morning, are you willing to help share God's story here at Heritage? Are you willing to be part of the way that God encourages the people who show up with you here every Sunday morning? This morning and moving forward, we've always had this designated area. You go out these doors and down the hallway to the left there, right on the other side of that wall, there's a place called the Hub where you can go and ask questions about how to take next steps and what it would look like for you to move forward in your connection with Heritage and especially toward volunteerism. But, Kevin told you too, you can do this online. I mean, we've got the QR code. I'll show you a version of it that fits on the screen. We've got you can do this online. You don't even have to talk to somebody at the beginning, you can scan the code and you can go and you can find out about ways to get connected with service. You can find out about ways that your gifts could match with the needs of your church family. And when that happens, when you experience God working through you to bless somebody else, that's when you start to really experience a different level of awareness and consciousness of the reality reality of God, because you're like, I couldn't have done that by myself. God did that through me. And Kevin mentioned, you don't have to sign your life away. You don't have to show up with all the knowledge of what it is that you have to do. We'll help you figure it out, and we'll help you find the right fit so that serving others is something that's life-giving for you and not just something that's draining for you. But whatever your skills are, whatever your spiritual gifts are, you can find a way to be involved in telling the story of God in this place. And you'll be so glad that you did. Because there are going to be people who are going to come to faith in this church. They're going to come to faith in God while they're in this church. Let me put it that way. And they're going to say, I came to Heritage and I stuck around and I got to learn about Jesus because when I first showed up, the family of God treated me like I was one of their own. Because when I first showed up, people loved on me and took care of me and cared for my kids and made me feel like I belonged and made me feel welcomed. I don't know if you can remember it, but you had a first day at Heritage too. And I hope that was your experience. But we can work together to make sure it's the experience for the next one, right?